Muy buenos días a todos y bienvenidos al webinar de hoy, Planificación y Redensificación para el aprovechamiento del suelo intraurbano para vivienda social. Este es nuestro primer webinar de la serie Estrategias para promover la vivienda social en ciudades de América Latina y el Caribe. Soy María Camila Uribe, coordinadora de la red de ciudades del BID, y me complace abrir este espacio de intercambio de conocimiento sobre cómo mejorar el aprovechamiento del suelo para promover la vivienda social. Antes de comenzar, quisiera recordarles que, bueno, hoy el webinar lo vamos a llevar principalmente en español, pero lo pueden oír en inglés o en portugués a través de la interpretación simultánea.
You can hear it. All you have to do is click in the globe and choose your language of choice.
Você pode escolher o idioma da sua preferência no símbolo do mundo debajo del menú. En caso de tener alguna pregunta para los panelistas, los invitamos a agregarla en la sección de Q&A.
Do you have any questions? Add in the Q&A.
Los panelistas podrán responder las preguntas de la audiencia también en el espacio final de esta sesión.
Panelists will answer questions at the end. This session will be available in YouTube next week, and we are sharing the link. We are a regional platform that wants to facilitate the exchange of knowledge and good practices in Latin American. Given the nature of the organization, we generate dialogue between the public, private sectors and the academia, and also we take advantage of the knowledge of different sectors in the bank. This is how we want to contribute to the strengthening of leadership, capacity building, and promoting synergies with allied institutions. For more information, follow the link in the chat. This year we have, in the schedule of these webinars, we have 4 meetings. The first one was on climate change in Latin American cities and the Caribbean after COP28 as drivers of climate action, which are available in the YouTube channel. The second one is this one. Then in September, we will talk about pollution in Latin American cities. And finally, in October, we will talk about biodiverse and resilient cities in Latin America and the Caribbean, taking advantage of the biodiversity COP that we will have. We invite you to review the blogs related to these topics and build sustainable cities. So now let's start with today's webinar. Latin American and Caribbean cities face a challenge in terms of social inclusion in urban sites. Millions of people live in neighborhoods with 1/3 of the households belong to the poverty level. These neighborhoods don't have utilities. They are vulnerable to endemic diseases. The magnitude of the challenge is huge. The housing deficit in Latin America and the Caribbean impact more than 55 million households, representing 45% of the total population. And in spite of a positive evolution, we estimate that to close that housing deficit will take more than 30 years. We will address key strategies to move forward on this planning to rethink how we can generate soil banks, how we can optimize social housing subsidies. Today's webinar on planning and exploitation of intra-urban soil, we will talk about how we can exploit urban soil.
densamente pobladas, donde el suelo es un recurso
We
limitado.
believe that soil is a limited and expensive resource. We will also see how we can improve quality of life of urban residents and public transportation and employment. We will see the case of Guatemala and Panama, who will work on the implementation of these strategies for social housing in terms of redensification. We want to find positive solutions that will improve the life of our citizens. We will start with a panel of experts to talk about the relevance of planning and urban redensification. We have Sara Topelson, director of the research center de la casa called CIROC, and Maria Mercedes Maldonado, part of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Then we will have Eva Campos. She's the executive director of the company Metropolitana de Vivienda in Guatemala. Jorge Alvarez, who is the CEO of Grupo OTI. He will present the Panama case. Then we will have Sara Topelson. Then we will have some time for Q&A. So please listen to the presentations and write your questions in the chat. We want to have a great conversation today. But before we start, I would like to ask a couple of questions to the audience. Please scan the barcode, the QR code to answer the first question. In your opinion, what are the redensification benefits and exploiting soil for social housing? So please scan and answer the first question. What do you think the benefits are?
Mejorar calidad de vida, dinamizar las lógicas urbanas, reactivar el área urbana.
We will see improved quality of life, sustainable social development, better access to utilities, equity, social development. Let's go to the second question then. What strategies to promote social housing in centric areas do you know? Let's go to the second question. Please scan the QR code.
Y bueno, vamos entonces a la tercera aquí para nuestro moderador y panelistas.
Now we go to the third question. What measures would facilitate financial access for social housing projects in centric areas? Do you know of any?
Proyectos gubernamentales. Proyectos urbanos, alquiler social. Bueno, ahí hay algunas medidas de acceso.
Well, here we see some access measures. I think with these answers, we give the floor to the conversation, and we will start with Martin Soulier. Martin is a senior specialist for urban development Welcome, Martin, and thank you for being here today. And thank you, panelists, for being here today as well. Thank you. Thank you, Maria Camila. It is a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. This is a great topic. You were talking about informal settlement and how to remedy the situation of informal settlements, but we should work on the cause of this. And within those causes, access to social housing is one of the variables. Local governments can do a lot to improve this, to promote planning and redensification for social housing allows for better housing for everyone. It can contribute to a more sustainable urban development when the population is increasing, reducing the need for expansion to agricultural areas. Financing social housing with additional resources would also help. This would bring greater greater equity. It can allow local governments to finance infrastructure and utilities without depending on fiscal funds, improving the efficiency of the use of public resources. This topic has a lot of sides, but we're going to start talking to two panelists. I invite them to join the session. I'm talking about Maria Mercedes Maldonado and Sara Topelson. Maria Mercedes Maldonado is an attorney. She is a researcher from Colombia. She's part of the Lincoln Institute
Especialista en Derecho Urbano,
for Land Policy. She's a specialist in urban law, soil policies, urban financing, right to housing, and informality in terms of access to soil. She was Secretary of Habitat for the Mayor's Office in Bogota. She helped the development plan in Colombia. She's a researcher for the Universidad Nacional from Colombia and Universidad de los Andes. She's a distance professor for urban management. She has a master's in urban studies, and she also has a master's from University of Paris. She has written many um, books highlighting urban reform and territorial development. We also have with us Sara Topelson. She's an architect. She founded her own company to develop urban projects. She is a recognized person in the architecture sector. She has been a professor of the Guanajuato University. She has been a director of Linkback. Sara currently directs the research center La Casa Sioc, where she promotes um, the status of housing in Mexico, which has been published since 2004 till 2022. Thank you both for joining our conversation, and I would like to start with Maria Mercedes with a triggering question. What are the instruments municipalities have to promote social housing in urban settings? Then we will continue with the rest of the conversation, and then we'll talk to Sara. Thank you, Maria Mercedes. Thank you, Martin. Greetings to Maria Camila Uribe. It's great to see her again. Hello, Sara, and everyone who joins today. Thank you for the possibility of participating in this interesting discussion. Before getting into your question, in terms of what instruments do municipalities have, I would like to highlight something you said in the introduction, and that is the importance of a change in the national policies. National governments have addressed housing policies from a sectorial logic, and they have put aside territorial planning and soil policies. This is a national government's responsibility. It is thought that it is a local thing, but the main responsibility lies on the national government. Most governments in the region have financing policies for urban expansion projects. The instruments municipalities have in Latin America, I think that the first one and the most comprehensive is to change the logic of urban planning. The first instrument is the territorial ordering plans. Not all municipalities have it as a plan. There are several: Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Uruguay, El Salvador. Several have territorial plans, also Guatemala. But in general, the logic has been to appoint use without demanding um, anything from the soil owners and promoting from local urban planning with a logic similar to the national policies. So first, we need to change the logic of urban planning. Some countries from past experiences have well-designed plans. So when cities have grown, the incentive of the densification project is attractive. There are some countries that have a legal framework that supports soil policies, and the regulation is there with a huge possibility for densification. So the introduction of the instruments is difficult. And there is a big discussion with the private sector. We see those who have to restate a regulation that has been delivered for a long time. And the instruments, well, we need to have a comprehensive plan. Mass transportation systems are important. The metro, for instance, when you incorporate a transportation system, you need to incorporate urban operations in the influence zones, which include a mixed use. Maria Camila was talking about the advantages, and we need to promote social blending and to eliminate exclusion in the cities. So when you authorize graded possibilities, you need to subject building. We need to build social housing. It, it shouldn't be tied only to the price, because we need to reach low-income households. When planning has already been delivered and the regulation has already been delivered, the instrument would be urban obligations. Any new project must include percentages of social housing. In Colombia, that is automatic, even if the urban planning doesn't have it. Any soil incorporated to urban use must include 20% of the area for social housing. But we need to move forward. That needs to take place when there is densification. But when the regulation has been delivered, we need to incorporate that. Somebody was talking about uh, right transfers. We have that in the head for conservation, but it can be used in general. Bogota did it in its recent plan in 2021. Bogota had several instruments for urban expansion, and we had not been working in densification. And what Bogota did was to establish a basic index of 1.3. There are some exceptions, and to increase building or development, we need to have public space. We need to update the public services because of densification, and we must include priority social housing. And we need to promote projects that associate several uh, soils so that we can have that blend. One of the resistance to these instruments are social disparity and exclusion in our countries. We see great resistance to social blending, but if we do it by zones, it can be done. We then will see the possibility of this. We can appoint a minimum area and build projects with social blending. And the last point that will show that we can reverse the order we do in which we do things in terms of urban development is the use of government land. Cities, in many Latin American cities, because of lack of use, because of changes in social function, public functions, the government prefers to sell that land to get resources. So to identify government land for social blending would be the fourth instrument. Thank you, Martin. Excellent, Maria Mercedes. Your points are very important. National urban planning, commitment to create social housing, to promote the use of fiscal land or government land. We will go back to you. We know that you need to leave before the session finishes, so we will take advantage of your presence now. Now, let's move on to Sarah Doppelson. Thank you for being here. I understand you have a presentation to share. The idea would be to ask you what are the main benefits of redensification and urban exploitation for social housing. Thank you, Sarah. First of all, thank you for the invitation. Paloma Silva, you, Martin, Maria Camila Uribe, and it's a pleasure to share this dialogue with Maria Maldonado. Yes, we coincide on all of the points that Maria has highlighted. In fact, the first thing we need are territorial ordering plans and also to specify the urban obligations and use available land in centric parts of the city. If you want, we don't have to show the presentation because with this introduction and this orientation from Maria, I would say that what we have found in most cities where we want to redensify, we see enormous resistance. But you know what? Let me show the presentation, and I will refer to the resistance. Let's share the screen, please.
Bueno, un poco con el tema que indicaron de la planificación y la redensificación.
Well, we were talking about planning and redensification for the exploitation of intra-urban soil. I refer to what happens in Mexico because this is one of the reasons why we need to use redensification, at least in Mexico, and it is very similar in Latin America. 80% of the population live in cities. Out of the 122 million people, 104 million people live in cities, and that requires specific attention. UN Habitat estimates that by 2030, it'll be 83% of the population. The demand for urban housing is continuous, and especially people with lower incomes. There is a possibility to build social housing in the city. We need to redensify those underused spaces. We need to assess the potential of vacant soil, and we need to build comprehensive communities. Developers want to build for middle class and higher. They're not interested in social housing, but this is the interest of the government. We need to build comprehensive communities where everyone has possibilities. We can then have better environments for citizens, and that stimulates economic growth. Obviously, within urban planning, we need to make an inventory of the vacant soil. The normativity of soil use needs to take care of the social housing challenge. We need to stimulate a model for a compact city. We need to start getting compact. We need to simplify cost and processes for regulation and soil use. The process to get a permit can last from 6 months to 2 years, and this is lengthy. And then costs increase in terms of how long it takes, and this stimulates um, construction. An important topic is to regulate parking regulation for housing. You don't need to have parking because we're talking about downtown. I understand that people need parking when they live out of the city, but when you have good transportation in the city, you don't need to have parking lots. Parking lots increases housing costs. Today, we should digitalize all of the ordering plans, urban developments, all of the permits should be digitalized, and this would make the process easier. And we need to stimulate the strategic control of housing density. The picture that I show you here, if you see there is a low zone and then high rises. When we get to this zone, which was residential, the zone was redensified, and this allowed where there was a house, a triplex was built. It was a measured redensification. Instead of one house, you would have three houses, and that was successful because the area was redensified without high rises. Of course, there are smart people who built, people who wanted to bend the law and they built higher buildings, but this regulated change was successful. This was done under legislation. We also need to exploit vacant urban soil. We need to measure the height levels. I think for this zone it was 10 meters, and there are many benefits in terms of agglomeration. People move less, you require less cars, and for this you require government support. We need to manage subsidies for lower income families.
Quitarle cargas fiscales para que sea factible, agilizar y reducir.
We need to reduce the cost of processes and permits, which is one of the biggest problems for redensification. And finally, there is a lot of vacant soil in Mexico. There are abandoned buildings, underused buildings, and parking lots like the one we see. That's where they place cars that have a ticket. This shouldn't be in the city. It should be 10 kilometers away from the city. Who cares where they put them? In a study by the Urban Soil Institute in the city, it says that 8 to 10% of the soil is underused in the city. This is partially true because we need to add all of the empty lots that are sitting there just for speculation. The best located lots are just sitting there waiting to become more expensive. And the final reflection is that today, at least in all Mexican cities, and I think in Latin America as well, it is urgent to plan order management, intra-urban soil, analyze underused lots and the potential for social housing development. Urban vacuums create lack of security, and they present a great opportunity for housing development and urban consolidation. We need to have planning policies to rehab underused zones for social housing, public policy for recovering vacant soil,
de los desarrolladores y de la población para construir vivienda social en zonas céntricas.
We need to build social housing in centric zones. And of course, the reduction of the processes, time frames, and we need to digitalize the plans. Having said this,
que hay un tema que manejamos muy poco.
I would like to add something. In architecture,
es sustentable.
We talk about sustainability. We want for everything to be sustainable. Use of water and power has to be sustainable. How about sustainable soil use?
Tiene que ver con el reciclaje.
And this has to do with recycling. We're talking about circular economy.
¿Por qué no hablamos del reciclaje urbano? Reciclar los centros de nuestras.
How about urban recycling? Cities that are underused. We need to reuse urbanized soil.
El suelo que ya está urbanizado. Necesitamos usar.
We need to use the installed infrastructure. Transportation is installed.
Tenemos que, sí, mejorarlas.
Water networks, we have to improve it. And we have to reuse them with a sustainable look.
Como resultado, pues una mejor calidad de vida.
This will lead to a better quality of life, better social cohesion, and we move less.
Problemas serios que sufrimos, por supuesto, en Bogotá y en la ciudad.
The problem we have in Bogota and Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, is mobility. Traffic is generating contamination. And if we moved less because we live in centric areas, we reduce the need to move and we reduce contamination. I have more topics, but I think I have said enough. Thank you very much. Excellent. I love that term, sustainable soils. Recycling soil is key. I would like to ask you a question about the topics that we are discussing. Soil recycling, what can we do so that local governments can drive that from the private sector? What would you recommend to local governments who are watching us? What can they do to drive participation of the private sector? Thank you, Martin. I understand your question perfectly because local governments resist the use of salt. They don't want any more neighbors. They don't want more population. We need to go against this resistance. And one of the better strategies with local governments is that we need to help them see that each square meter the city grows requires a huge budget from the municipality for maintenance of water, light, roads, transportation networks. Each time we recycle and we look within, we optimize the installed infrastructure, we optimize resources, and we generate less expenditure. If you have a city with 30 hectares, you require more police for all of the infrastructure I mentioned, streets, water, electricity, parks, but it requires more police, more ambulances, more health centers, new public spaces, other schools. If you grow 100 hectares, how much will that cost? So the cities have to do an exercise, a domestic exercise of the cost of urban expansion. We did an exercise on urban expansion in Los Cabos in Mexico, and the expenses are huge. Municipal authorities fear that that will take popularity away. Well, no, they are going to become more popular. This is good for the authorities and for the population. Maria Mercedes, did you want to add something? But I want to ask you another question as well. When you were mentioning the different instruments which are important, how about enforcement? How can local governments enforce regulation? Because you have the plans, you have the regulations, the different instruments, but what about the control? What actions can local governments take to improve those aspects? And feel free to make your comment as well. Thank you, Martin. I wanted to complement one more instrument. Sarah mentioned the use of urban vacancies. In Colombia, we, we have a different name for that. Colombia has an instrument that is not well applied, but we have it, and that is priority construction statement. So we have a 12-year plan, and we have 4-year plans as well. Any of those plans can establish that unused lots are declared as building lots, and the owner has 3 years to build or develop. And if the owner hasn't done it in 3 years, the lot is forcefully sold so that developers or builders or other housing organizations can buy it in a bid, and the municipality can use it for social housing. If we have those percentages for social housing, which should correspond to the housing need, the socioeconomic composition for each municipality would dictate it. That's a great mechanism in the development market, and it can be very efficient. So the lot goes to a bid, it can be expropriated, then the value would be lower, even in cities with good cadastre. In 2012, Bogota started using that, and it's an instrument so that if you have 3 years to get something done. Instruments are not going to work without public management. And now I want to answer the question that you asked me. In 2012, it was said that underused buildings or buildings without any use, you have 18 months to do something about it or the government will intervene. There are urban vacancies, and we need municipal entities to follow up. The lots have been identified, and the idea is to put together owners with developers, because sometimes you have um, ownership problems. Sometimes there are difficulties, or sometimes owners want to wait to see if the price of the lot increases. Since 2008, Bogota started with urban lots. In 2012, we included lot for construction. And this has to do with something Sara said, and that is reusing and recovering existing buildings. One of the problems of densification is that it gets to a point where this becomes a problem. Big towers for social housing can be a problem. Maintenance of the buildings, living, so many people living together. We would need another webinar to talk about the vertical communities, but I like what Sara said, measured densification. In Colombia, we are seeing that already. But I think that we have to incorporate in the agenda recycling of buildings. And also we need to look at financing, because national governments don't have that. Credits to subdivide a house, improving the building, the existing building, and also generating several new units, 3, 4, 5. But that has to become a permanent program to see what are the financing sources. Because the problem with this is that apparently urban expansion is easier, faster, soil price is lower. We have quantified how much it would cost to have utilities and transportation. So we have to think about the point Sarah made. And the other instrument in several cities in Latin America is to charge a housing tax, a higher tax for um, vacant lots. And how to do it?
The first that has to change the approach for policies are national governments. A national government is interested in building, I don't know how many millions of square meters quickly, easy. And we saw what happened with Mexico with its expansion. So if we do not rethink, if the national government doesn't rethink the approach of its housing policies, say, for example, stimulating it with some more soft loans for constructors of these projects, distributing at the least a 50-50 of subsidies, we have to rethink about different strategies. Once again, on the side of loans for the subdivision and recovery of construction that is deteriorating, that would be to lose a significant amount of habitants that would have an impact. We cannot bring other models into the city. This implies a profound reestablishment of national policies and of its financing devices. Excellent, Maria Mercedes, very clear. Reusage of buildings is something very important. We have different topics turning around in our heads in Latin America and the Caribbean. This has to do not only for sales, but for social renting with social guarantees, in fact. And hopefully we won't be with this for a long time. I could talk about this for a long time. It's very interesting, but we must continue with the webinar as it was established. I invite you, in your case, Maria Mercedes, you have a commitment now, but Sarah, you could stay until the end of the webinar where we'll open for Q&A. I thank you both for your very interesting participation. Thank you very much. I'm going to try and listen to the presentations. I'm very interested in them. Thank you very much. Now we will go to our first case study. We're going to Guatemala, and we invite Eva Campos here. She's an urbanist. She works with the Metropolitan Association of Housing in Guatemala. She's an architect and she has a master's degree in territorial and urban development by the Polytechnic University of Catalonia. She has also worked studied in Holland. Over 15 years of experience in public policies. She has led teams in urban planning, sustainability, and housing of the municipality of Guatemala. She's a founding partner of the Association of Architects in Guatemala and of Urbanists in Iberoamerica. She has worked in institutional strengthening and the entry of municipal projects promoting equitable access to cities and sustainable urban development. Eva, thank you for your participation and welcome. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to share this time with you in this webinar to discuss the strategies that we have implemented to be able to promote social housing. In this case, it's called priority and equitable. And we can see that it is key. We're starting to see the significance of establishing standards and plans, and to use this in the challenges to overcome promoting the re-densification, where we need location of social housing, which is a priority in this case, and capturing a surplus, which we have to modify for feasibility purposes. What we're doing now is talking about the current context where we've been able to see what urban development is working on with programs that gather 30 projects with about 4,000 priority and affordable housing with private investment in significant figures. And it's important to see what this means for a city in the Central American context to be able to consolidate a project and a proposal for social housing using this. So for us as a city, this is an effort of over 20 years where we begin by strengthening the cadastral matters with charging a property tax, having instruments for profiting from or from being able to afford the road costs to build roads. And this is when we started to look into land classification, where we've established the principles of responsibility to access the enhanced uses of land. And beyond the fact that the conditions for these benefits was fair, as Dr. Maldonado has mentioned, the fact that this is established in the territorial plan. We have focus points for actions, and in this case, the housing companies, as part of the implementation of strategies to cater the needs of housing, looking into the private sector, we've implemented the priority housing project with a pilot project that leaves us lessons learned together with developers, looking into the needs as a priority for the population that we want to cater with the capabilities, looking into the price and conditions, which is something that where we have to look into what we can do together to see the participation of the private sector. This leaves us guidelines to be set up for priority matters, which it began at the beginning of 2020 in a very difficult context because everyone's occupation was elsewhere. But there were projects that allowed for us to measure the performance of the regulations and looking into the aspects that could make a difference implementing at scale. And we had a reform quickly. We saw this in 2022. And from then on, we were able to reconcile this strategy and program. I cannot disregard the significance of institutional strengthening because it's starting the establishment of our clear goals and strengthening technical capabilities. That's where we can address the housing policies that are articulated with territorial development. We have to acknowledge that this requires an institutional specialization that is highly complex. It's not intuitive, and it isn't solved by a professional of construction, an attorney. It's an expertise that requires specialized training that is highly complex. And based on that, the housing companies have seen themselves as an urban operator, and maybe the largest potential is in summing up efforts in the housing sector, strengthening the value chain and articulating everything that can be contributed to the housing and urban development plans. In that sense, for us, part of the understanding of needs that have not been created, where we see that 80% of these numbers are what is concentrated in the city of Guatemala. It's a naturalized reality that the formal market is serving less than 30% of households, and 70% is fully outside excluded, and that's the reality in our context. And in terms of acting with a public policy vision, meeting our mandate as well with a municipal entity, the housing demands are reaching figures of 150,000 units in the central urban area. And when we look into what the private sector is producing, approximately 4,000 units at a metropolitan scale, focused exclusively in the tip of the pyramid, which is the mid-high economic sector, which is what the market is interested in. That's not a good or bad thing. It's the nature of this. But what should we do in cities to live in this logic of a market, to increase the offering? When we talk about the extreme poverty, it is over 65% of the households in our central urban area, and also starting to propose action strategies to access housing with more experience adapted to every need. Looking into priority housing, all of the effort is towards generating housing alternatives in the areas that are classified with the zoning plan as urban, central, and core, which are near transportation systems and near the productive realities of the city. And it is set up in sectors, but we should not concentrate these sectors into these sectors because we don't want to speculate. In terms of instruments that make it possible to see where the potential of mobilization is and resources for funding the urban infrastructure and social housing, this is a summary of the instruments that exist in our cities and that we can have access to at a national scale. There's large fragility. We have the municipal code and the housing law, and this with very vague connections in terms of what to do with the municipality. And it's starting from that point where we have the principles, where we develop a first level instrument for the zoning plan. And then there can be supplementary plans. These plans have not been developed, but they're needed. This is a huge opportunity. And then we have the second level regulations, which are the enablers of construction permits. And in that scale is where we locate priority housing. So after knowing all of these instruments and the influence in usage of land, we have designed a special norm that is made towards fostering private investment and be more competitive for housing development, the land that is of interest, of social interest. And this is a challenge. How do we have land for this use? Here we're illustrating in colors the incentives and responsibilities, which in other terms could be the benefits and incentives in blue. The standards have certain indexes that are exclusive for priority housing. We are then looking into a better use of land. We are looking into having parking spaces. They can have it, but as a priority housing, they can opt out of that. This allows to use the constructive system as best possible, optimizing the land with more apartment areas. And this means a reduction of the cost or the financial yield. We've also included the possibility of coordinating priority housing with affordable housing with variable percentages depending on the zoning plan. And on the other hand, all of these benefits are conditioned to a responsibility of the developer, which is to generate housing with a price limit, 91 minimum wages for 46 square meter units, and there's a proportionality as direct between price and size. And the obligation, the load, is also the same way to to serve the priority population. Priority housing it's a vision of the mayor, and through it, we have access to property. It's within the priority housing policies, and this is focused to cater segments where we're concentrating a high deficit, and these are those who need to work in the city of Guatemala. And here we have a demand of over 30,000 housing units. I apologize. I have a cold right now. All of these incentives are what is understood by the standards in a way in which the contributions of the municipality, after having all of the instruments, they realize that we can estimate the value that is needed here. We look into cost benefits versus other projects, and this is signed in a compliance contract, which is verified by the housing company when we have catered the target population. This is how to reinforce these standards, the best allies are mortgage providers. And at the end, if a project doesn't have a constant compliance by the municipality, then it can't happen. And this generates a very complex financial issue. And therefore, they're some of the main stakeholders that are looking into this compliance. And for us, this represents this centralization to guarantee that the project is catering the priority population. The results at this point, here we have the transportation system and the projects in different stages. This is an achievement to see that 70% of the housing in this point are less than 200 meters from the main transportation systems, the best classified in the municipality. And here, on the right, we see a summary of the rates, how we're translating this for the target population. Priority housing also has moved the financial sector, and we have a significant participation of national banking that, as a national bank and having certain benefits, some don't pay certain taxes, this allows to extend financing periods of a versus a regular rate. And they're 80% at 5 kilometers from the downtown area of the city. These are images of the projects that we've finished. Some are also under construction. And the social outreach, we have served 82% of households with an income of 1.5 to 3 minimum wages. And we've also catered 30% of housing or households under the poverty line. We thought this wasn't going to be possible, but there are more favorable conditions day after day to extend our reach. The strategy is of incidence in the housing offering. The private sector for middle and high segments generate 1,000 housing units, 4,000. And priority is projecting a similar quantity for low to mid-low income households. We are also looking into discounts in municipal rates for sustainable construction. The prospects, we seek to strengthen local and international alliances, articulate public policies of the national municipal government. We've been working with the new government in the design of new regulations for subsidies, for priority housing and central urban housing, where we articulate subsidies for municipalities that have the zoning plan housing that is located in the public transportation system. And this is very important to facilitate housing for lower income sectors. And we also need to work in some incentives or subsidies in a very clear way, setting the proper conditions in terms of quality as needed. Because at this point, we don't have supply. We have a lot of demand, so we have to increase that supply with co-allies, local, international as well, where we seek to implement new urban development programs that allow for us to address part of the deficit demand that we have accumulated in social foundation with people of lower income. This is all. Thank you very much. Excellent, Eva. What you've said is very interesting. Thank you for your presentation. We're going to go back at the end with some questions, but we have to go quickly to the next case with a different perspective. Jorge Alvarez Fonseca, I invite you to participate in this session. Jorge is the CEO of OTI. He is a civil engineer of the Metropolitan University, and he's done studies in finance in the Welfare School as a master's degree in construction business management. And he has had studies in acquisitions in Stanford. He has studied acquisitions in Stanford University. He's directing his company very successfully. Thank you for sharing today with us. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, IDB, for this invitation, and thank you to all the panel members. Basically, these are the cases of the experience in our company in terms of intra-urban development. This is basically a plan or a map of Panama City. On the southern side, we have the Pacific Ocean, which is a limitation in this sense. And on the other side, we have the canal. It's a protection area. And this has had 3 development zones, which is north, east, and west. This is between 30 and 60 kilometers of downtown area in the city. And these are typical developments beyond the regular urban one, where we have low densities of approximately 80 to 100 people per hectare, which is what the doctor mentioned before, which are very expensive developments for maintenance of cities. And so, and the owners of this housing don't have better access to public transportation, or they're victims of moving for 2 or 3 hours of transportation. They have to take different types of transportation, the subway, taxis, trains, and at the end of the day, this becomes the quality of life that these people have to face. So as developers, we have projects in in these areas. We have developments in the 3 areas. However, lately we've been trying to see the possibility. We'll see how we develop intra-urban projects. Recently, in a few years ago in Panama, we approved a new regulation that allows the development of social housing with 5 floors without an elevator, where we have a density of 1,200 people per hectare. And this has allowed to have social developments. And within cities, and this is our opinion, there's always lots that are available that aren't used, that can be supported for the development. And currently, here we show 2 particular lots. The red line and the purple line are the 2 metro lines that are working in Panama now. And these are lots that have a very good location. They already have public utilities, water, electricity. They have public transportation that is adequate, and they're close to education centers and recreational areas, health centers. And this is within the area where most of the jobs are generated in the city of Panama. And developing these centers isn't easy to get the lots. That is not always easy. In Panama, as the recent panel member said, the they have certain lots where they're waiting to be sold for a higher price, and they usually look for this type of housing. And in most of our Latin American countries, the deficit is in the lowest part of the pyramid in the social housing. That's where we have the highest demand. This has allowed for us to sit with some of the landowners, which aren't many here in Panama. Within the city, there are not many, and we've been able to develop certain agreements that are allowing for us to develop these projects. Basically, currently, we're developing these two locations, these two projects. Some are 2,200 apartments that are being developed in the northern area of the city, and the other one is a project of 900 households, apartments that we are developing on the eastern side of the city. These are buildings with 5 floors, and they're apartment of $70,000. In Panama, there is a law of preferential interest that allows for these apartments to have a subsidy over their rates, and basically our clients are subsidized 4 points on the active loan rates, with an active rate of 6.5, and the client ends up paying 2.5% during the first 10 years. Starting year 11 to 20 to 30, they have a free rate. But for the first 10 years, it helps them tremendously in acquiring their housing, and it is a very interesting policy. In our opinion, the development of this type of housing allows a higher density, which is very good for the city, because in the developments in peripheral areas, the infrastructure costs are much higher. And from maintenance perspectives, that's where we have all of this cost of cities that has to be developed with arteries to give access to all of this population mass. So we have a development where we have a vertical growth, which allows for us to give us an infrastructure that the city has already. Access of public transportation to public transportation already exists. We have the metro bus, and this makes a difference in the quality of life of those who purchase these projects. And as we mentioned, and we see this areas in the dormant areas, people have to wake up at 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning to go to their jobs. And with the new intra-urban projects, basically people will have an opportunity to wake up later and have a better quality of life. These are developments that are very interesting, but they have to be managed with a tremendous care, because the cost of a land is high, and we have to be very careful because we are looking into social housing specifically. So one of the reasons, as I mentioned before, for this program is to look into the level of density. It gives us 5 floors without an elevator. We have direct subsidies of $1,000, of $10,000 that the state gives the families for their first households, and this is a gift. It's not to be returned or paid, and this allows the development of this type of project. We do have huge challenges in generating communities, and the development of this type of project are tremendously dense, and this type of a stratum, this generates certain situations at the community level where the culture and idiosyncrasy of our clients are looking into a single family unit, and they're accustomed to having a relationship with the neighbors that is that immediate, and that creates a conflict. So in that sense, we have developed a series of community policies where we have community offices for the projects to create this feeling of belonging. And we recommend, and this is very important, to look into the mixed developments, in the sense that first, this helps you to ameliorate the cost. If you have a commercial area at the first on the first floor, that will give you a better return on investment in that land, and you generate more community, and you have a community that can be used with where they live for the first needs, for housing, and this gives a feeling of belonging that's very different from the city, where people basically go to sleep and they don't create a life or a community within these developments. This is the experience that we have. Excellent, Jorge. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I will invite the rest of the panel members to join us for this final portion, where we will try to answer certain questions. But before we go to that, I wanted to ask you something, Jorge, for continuity purposes. It's always interesting to me to ask the same questions, both in the public sector and the academy and the private sector. And this is, what can be done from the public sector's perspective to incentivize the participation of the private sector in the usage of urban usage, and how to do this, even though in a small percentage. Which are the two, three main things that the government, whether local or national, can be done? The main challenge, we have two large challenges. First, at least here in Panama, locally speaking, the permits and standards that are requested for the development of social housing are the same demands and standards that are in a luxury housing. So if you ask me, for example, about the developments that we have in the outskirts of the city, they have different demands from the permit standpoint, from the justification of what is requested versus what the city demands. Cities are getting accustomed to the luxury developments exclusively, and they specialize in standards which the largest development that is given. So what happens is that what we have in the city are not legal developments or artisanal that don't meet the standards, but they don't create a special one for social interest housing. So those who try to do this find this obstacle, this challenge of having to adapt to complex standards. For example, when we've launched this social interest housing, we launched a law that allows for these apartments not to have an elevator, but the office of the mayor didn't have the necessary regulations to build them. So that's what we have to overcome. How we manage firemen, for example, the fire department, and see how we have different types of buildings, let's say 20 floors. And here in Panama, the middle class has very high buildings. It's typical to have 20, 30, or 40 floors. And this makes it more difficult to have these permits. And the second point that one of the panel members mentioned was about the lots. Many people have lots that are not being used, and they have no cost whatsoever. I think the biggest problem we have is that we don't have any standard that sets a cost over the maintenance of this land. So here, for example, in Panama, basically people pay taxes and the property tax on the cadastral value of the house. If you have a family or a group that purchased land 20 years ago, the tax they pay on prime real estate is ridiculous, and they can wait as long as they want without having to use it. If we were to update the values, and based on that we were to charge a proper housing tax, then, or property tax, then the owner has an incentive of developing it or selling it, which is what happens currently. Excellent, Jorge. Thank you very much. For Eva and Sarah, we have a question from the audience. It comes from Colombia. And this refers to the national legislation, which is something that Maria Mercedes mentioned, authorizes the usage of several land management uses. What actions can the government have, the national governments, so that the beneficial principles of the national standards are materialized effectively at a local level? Who wants to answer this first? I think my answer is focused on the local perspective. So what would we expect? What can the government contribute to us? If we have land management, land usage, generating proper conditions so that the land where we need or we see the zoning plans are to be accessible, we need a supplement for the tools and national subsidies with the same coherence. We think that this is a huge contribution. So the subsidies for housing, urban housing, and dense housing, or this type of housing, should be more coherently connected to the urban infrastructure and the municipal obligations, so that the conditions that are generated to better use the land to facilitate the closeness to transportation systems and work on the housing system that is a verifier of compliance as well. It helps within the municipality. A housing investor will be needs to have a support. There's a clear interest in developing this, but at this point we don't have, as we mentioned recently, in the case of Panama, this also happens in Guatemala. There are different public policies, but this is a valuable tool. But what we are promoting currently with the national government is that subsidies for vertical housing, if I may, for urban areas, should be clearly destined for cities which have met the basic obligations that are determined in the municipal code, having a zoning plan, having a cadastral system, having a functional method to verify the compliance. And it's very uneven. There's a relationship between the application of the standards, as we've seen in the case of Panama, and this for the case of Guatemala as well. So you have the main municipality, which is one of the 17 in the metropolitan area, and the conditions are completely, municipalities don't have any regulations. This is something that's happened in neighboring cities and the capital city as well. So this could help level the conditions and make everyone meet the basic principles of zoning that have been requested. And when there are subsidies generated, they should be clear in their territorial orientation with certain competencies in the municipalities. Excellent, Eva. I am going to go to Sarah to close. And when I presented you, Sarah, I mentioned Sol, Colombia, but I meant Mexico. I apologize. I think you're muted. If you'd like to answer, and we could close. I agree with everything Eva has said. This is a complex situation. The intervention in city centers and in the federal government, the central government, we should establish obligations that the municipality and the owner should meet. Not only one, this is a conjunction of obligations from the municipality and the local authority and the owner. As Jorge well said, they cannot sit on these intra-urban grounds eternally. So part of the mechanisms that are important is, as Maria mentioned, in terms of tax loads, and that according to an established plan. She said that what has been done is that after 3 years of not intervening over a land, they put it out to sale. And that's a bit aggressive, 3 years. And in other countries, what they've done is that they allow a period of up to 5 years. But that goes in stages. The first 3 years are the invitation to present a project in development, and they start to do something about it. The fourth year is also so that they start any work. The fifth is the last one, and they might sell it. This also allows the opportunity of selling. You don't want to develop it, it's not your line, sell it. But those who sell commit to have a construction license included in the next 5, 6 to 8 months to have this dynamic. So this type of measure, of course, it helps the development and the regulations at a national level, and it should be at a national level, because the local authorities, many times, as I said before, are very cautious in setting measures that are not very popular. Because, of course, they're seeing their political career and they want to be reelected and they want to remain in a public position. So more drastic measures are more difficult for them. But if they come with an orientation of the national land policy, they have to abide by these laws and these regulations. So we have to integrate the entire line of responsibilities and stakeholders to be able to have positive results in the downtown areas and cities. Excellent, Sarah. Thank you very much. We have more questions from the audience. Unfortunately, we don't have time. It's been very interesting. We've seen all the presentations that we thank tremendously, and thank you all. Once again, thank you, everyone, and I will hand the floor to Paloma Silva to close this event. Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you to all of the participants. Very interesting to hear all of your interventions. This series of webinars are organized between Maria Camila and myself with the purpose of connecting the offering of housing solutions much more. And I'm talking about housing solutions because we're not only talking about new housing, but also rehabilitation in much better located areas. So the intention of this webinar was to integrate participants in the sector, in the academic sector, specialists in urban development and zoning, and local authorities and companies and the private sector. Of course, this is a task of the private, social, and public sector. So we thank you all very much for all of your interventions that could be summarized in the significance of planning and re-densification. We're using intra-urban land. Sarah Toppelson and Maria Mercedes Maldonado have shared valuable ideas on the challenges and solutions in the production of land for social housing and the re-densification and capture of goodwill and how this can fund the provision of social housing. We've explored new concepts like territorial sustainable management. I love this in Sarah. The re-densification, which is also smart re-densification, which is true in many areas where we've had rehabilitation and re-densification above what the infrastructures allow. The new neighbors and the neighbors that arrive have problems of access to water, to services, and therefore this of planning, proper planning, is very important to improve the quality of life of the urban residents and also the efficiency of public resources. Today, we are seeing many tragedies in different areas of our region in Latin America and the Caribbean, floods, natural disasters, for hurricane issues, and those who suffer the most are the informal settlements that don't have access to dignified housing because they cannot produce this social land with an infrastructure per proper urban equipping. And so cities in Latin America and the Caribbean that have been characterized by this high social economic inequality, with the presence of these informal precarious settlements with high levels of insecurity in land tenure, and with large segments that depend on informal economy, they represent a challenge for those who are here, public, social, and private sector. In this series of webinars, this is the first of several that we will be discussing. And we believe, and that's why we've organized these webinars, we believe that it's very important to generate this urbanized land because it is the main challenge. And I'm going to tell you, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, a month and a half ago, we had a conference that was very important with COP from the US and Fannie Ginny Mae. And we saw that they are not reaching this solution of dignified housing, and that's why the homeless community is growing in the US. So it's very important to see these topics that we mentioned around land, capturing the goodwill and prices of land and this scale economy. And we should not continue to have more housing in the peripheral areas. As Sarah said, the participation of the national government is here, and we are gathering together in these webinars with the city network, which is led by Maria Camila, and the housing sector, which is led by myself within IDB, to talk about these issues. And around the housing matters, the deficit of housing will not be fed by the exclusion of large sectors in the demand, but also this offering. These limitations that we were talking about with Jorge, and the lack of technical capability of some housing developers, restrict this potential that could be used in accessible housing without more stakeholders like social banking and developers financing sustainable development projects. We are not talking about that today, but we will have a webinar to open your appetite to talk about funding and sustainable housing. Where many times in vertical housing, this has its own challenges around the horizontal housing. So I'd like to highlight the lessons learned in this for what happened today. We see how Eva Campos has shared how the city is addressing planning and densification for the usage of intra-urban land, and she highlighted the significance of establishing standards and development plans that promote densification and the optimum use of land, and throughout municipal incentives and reduction of costs. And here Eva and Sarah address this. It is very important to reduce these costs, both transactional and in time, so that we can have priority housing that is accessible. Jorge mentioned this a while ago. The private sector needs to create a profit. And for this, we have seen many elements that from the national government, things like subsidies, licenses, permits that can all promote better access to services and private transportation and public transportation, reducing the carbon footprint as well. And now talking about the Panamanian sector, we Jorge explained how intra-urban high density projects have allowed to use the land better. And we can see that the private sector is now talking about how to promote housing not far from the downtown areas. But he also talked about the need of special policies to obtain these permits in the use of empty lots that cannot be developed. And also in the case of Guatemala, we saw how we have certain actions to use this intra-urban land. And so it is key that all of the stakeholders of the value chain, which is how we're working now with housing in IDB, from the local governments, national governments, and the private sector, social sector, can cooperate to reach these developments. So for this, it's necessary to promote and establish standards and development plans that foster densification, capturing goodwill, promoting affordable housing that's resilient and sustainable. And with this, we can reduce the deficit of housing for those who are facing the issue in the region. We thank you all, Maria Camila, Kanim, Martin, as a brilliant moderator, our speakers. And I'll talk a bit about the next steps in these series of webinars that you're invited to. In the second webinar, we'll talk about accessible land usage in cities. This is considered for Wednesday, May 29th. And then we will talk about subsidies that we talked about today, but we will go in depth to develop sustainable habitat solutions. That will be on June 5th. So please don't forget to give us feedback in this webinar. Your comments will be very important for us. You can scan the QR, which is on the screen, to obtain more information in the chat. And you can see this QR on the screen already. And then we thank the city network for organizing these webinars, Mauricio, Edgar. And remember, you can be in touch with the IDB team for any additional question. Thanks once again for your time. See you in the next webinar. I hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Gracias a todos.
Hasta pronto. Chao.
Hasta luego.